Okay, welcome again. Is this, am I getting, yes I am. Now the stragglers are coming in. All right, it's my pleasure to introduce your next speaker for this event. Someone whose work I had in fact been aware of for quite some time before I realized he was a colleague at Georgetown. And those of you who've worked in the field of international economics, labor economics, and indeed development will have been aware of her work as well. Professor Adriana Kugler is at the moment Vice Provost for Faculty Affairs in Georgetown. She's also a full professor at the McCourt School of Public Policy, or those of you who hadn't picked up the latest developments there, that's what used to be known as GPPI. She's also been, for 2 years, 2011 and 12, I believe, was the chief economist at the US Department of Labor. So this, in typical Georgetown fashion, combines the policy practice with the academic analysis. She's won, not surprisingly, a series of prizes, including the prize for the best contribution to globalization, regulation, and development. And as you would expect, her papers have been published in just about all the top economics journals in the fields, the American Economic Review, the Review of Economics and Statistics, American Economic Journal, you name it, she's been in it. Of course, also the Journal of Labor Economics. And again, not surprisingly perhaps, given what I've just said, her work's been featured in the more policy-oriented publications such as World Bank development reports, etc. And the first instance I'd come across her work was actually in The Economist magazine, where she's in The Economist and various other publications of that sort, as well as on media, C-SPAN, and a number of other outlets. Her work has been recognized as really making a difference. And I gather that while being vice provost and full professor at the moment, she still manages to get out into the policy community. So, without further ado, Professor Kugler.
Well, thank you, Gerd. That was way too generous, but thank you very much. And I'm very excited to be here. As Gerd mentioned, I work on development, but I've typically focused in other parts of the world. I have actually never been to the Middle East before. Aside from Israel, I have not been to this side of the Middle East, so I'm very excited to be here. And I'm very interested in this part of the world, and as I was preparing my presentation, I learned a lot myself, and I'm looking forward to having a conversation between us as well. So let me talk, before we even talk about globalization and institutions and the role that they play in development, I want to talk about kind of how the Middle East is placed in terms of development and different measures of development that we typically use. So as you know, a very typical measure of development tries to measure well-being, human well-being. And one very typical way of measuring human well-being is by focusing on economic well-being. So given that usually average income is used as one very good measure of development. Another measure of development that usually gets used is kind of the possibility of advancing in terms of economic well-being. So GDP growth, right, or the growth of GDP per capita, of that average GDP, is another very good way of measuring development. But of course, Amartya Sen and many others have considered development in a much broader sense of human development, of advancing a person's capabilities. So the capabilities approach towards development tries to capture other aspects of human well-being, including health, including education, and how that advances a person's possibility, even in terms of their economic well-being. So that's usually been measured actually quite well by the new Human Development Index that the United Nations actually has come up with over the last decade or so. So let me talk about this first measure of development that we typically use, this average income, or GDP per capita, and how the Middle East places in terms of that measure of development. Well, if you look at that measure of development, actually, Qatar actually is number one. In 2012, Qatar actually was placed number one. Kuwait was placed number 16. Saudi Arabia was placed number 28, and many other countries, most of the countries actually in the Gulf, placed in the top 35. So in fact, most countries do very well. There's still some countries in the region, though, that are placed under the average income per capita around the world, under the 10,000 mark, which is the average income around the world. And so there is certainly, there's a lot of variation, and there's certainly some countries that very much lag behind. So these are the countries that I mentioned, right, which are above these 10,000 mark. There's some that are just around the 10,000 mark, which is the average around the world. And then you still have countries such as Jordan, Syria, and certainly Yemen, which lag way behind. So while for the most part, and if you think in particular about Qatar, right, it placed number 1 in the world, there's still some countries in the region which are still really lagging way behind. So there is a whole lot of variability, but for the most part, you can really see the darkness in this map and how many of the countries in the region actually fare very well as far as economic well-being. If one looks at GDP growth, so the possibility not only of, right, being high up in terms of economic well-being, but the possibility of moving up throughout time in terms of economic well-being and the next generation being able to continue to progress, GDP growth is actually pretty high. So you can see again here, there are many, many countries, including Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Kuwait, Oman, that have very, very high growth rates, over 5%, which is way above the 3.3% that you find on average around the world. There are other countries, though, Jordan, UAE, Bahrain, which are just around the average, between 2 and 3%, which is about the average around the world. And there are even some countries such as Yemen, which are contracting. So that doesn't show as good a picture as this other measure that we talked about before of income per capita. And here's a map. So this is what I was saying about Yemen, which is contracting. There are other countries such as Jordan, as I mentioned, Syria, and Bahrain, which are at 2 and 3%. But then you have Saudi Arabia growing at 6%. You have some of these other countries such as Oman and such as Qatar and Kuwait growing at very, very fast rates. But as I said, this is a very limited measure of development. In a sense, we want to talk about the broader measure of human development, the possibility of moving up, of having possibilities as a human being beyond just economic well-being. And the Human Development Index has done a great, great job at measuring this up. What they do is basically they take economic development and economic well-being as one of the measures, but they also quantify health, and they also quantify education as years of education. Health they measure as life expectancy throughout a person's life. And interestingly, when you use that measure of development, the Human Development Index, the region looks well, but it actually falls in terms of rankings around the world, which tells you something about how the region is faring in terms of health and in terms of education. It means that while the region is way up there in terms of economic well-being, in terms of health, in terms of education, in terms of other measures of human well-being, the country is maybe not doing quite as well. And that's certainly the case. It shows up in education, where the levels of education are not very low, not below primary schooling or so, but they're just at the level of high school. So you don't see these very high levels of educational attainment that you see in some of the other high-income countries that are equivalent to the Middle Eastern, the Gulf countries in many other ways. So in terms of that, you still have many countries doing quite well in terms of this Human Development Index. So this is a ranking just of those countries in the Arab League in terms of HDIs. And many of them still qualify as high human development or high human development just because part of this measure does capture this economic well-being, right? Average income. So obviously, since the region is doing so well in that dimension, these countries all still fall very much up there. On the other hand, you still have countries such as Jordan and Yemen. Look at Yemen. Yemen is particularly low at a very low Human Development Index because they do badly both in terms of income per capita, but they do quite badly as well in terms of health and educational attainment. If you look at, there's something called the inequality-adjusted HDI. That inequality-adjusted HDI shows even a lower ranking of some of the countries, in particular because you have, and we were here in the previous panel talking about women, right? There's some differences in the population in terms of who has access and who doesn't have access to education and health, and that really shows up in the inequality-adjusted Human Development Index. So the region overall is doing really quite well in terms of development, but there are some aspects certainly that still require work. Obviously, we're here sitting in Education City, and we know that there are efforts that are being made, in the past decade, in the past 2 decades, to really move up in terms of educational attainment. So there's very much a lot of awareness of how the region is still falling behind in terms of educational attainment and how there is a need really to move forward in terms of this dimension. So what's behind the success of the region, right? So there are usually 2 stories when you think about development. One is a story about kind of endowments and natural endowments and geography. So kind of a very deterministic view of the world. The other one is a view about what institutions are in place and how institutions affect the capacity of a country to develop and to move forward over time. So when we think about geography, we generally think about things such as climate. We think about access to waterways. We think about access to natural resources. So starting with weather, right? That's not actually something that actually helps the region. When you think about the region is really very close to the Tropic of Cancer. And we know that proximity to the tropics causes disease, tropical diseases, and these tropical diseases tend to make a country lag behind in terms of development, not only in terms of health, education, but also in terms of income. So certainly that's not an aspect that tends to help the region. As you can see, in Oman and Yemen, there's still very high levels of malaria, incidence of malaria. Saudi Arabia and UAE are pretty much there as well in terms of being in the tropics, but the incidence of malaria has been reduced over time. So that's when you start thinking, well, maybe institutions, maybe the institutional framework and what you put in place makes a difference as well. And it's not just as deterministic as something, that it's where you're placed geographically or what your natural endowments are as a country. Another thing that is known to affect development, that is known to affect growth, is access to waterways, access to navigable waters. And here, the region actually does really well. Obviously, we can all see the Gulf from here, right? We're basically surrounded by water. And that means that facilitates trade, that facilitates this engaging in the process of globalization that we have been seeing throughout the last decades in the region. Obviously, in Saudi Arabia, there's still many places which are fairly remote, but for the most part, the whole region really has an advantage as it relates to access to waterways and access to international markets. So the other thing, so we have kind of a balancer, right? Tropical diseases, presence of tropical problems that come out because of tropical climate are a minus in terms of development for the region. On the other hand, access to waterways helps the region. And then another thing that people usually consider as something that contributes to development is access to natural resources. And here it's not clear. It could actually go both ways. It could be a blessing, or it could actually be a curse. And it actually depends very much on what the institutions in place are. So obviously, we all know that the greatest resource in the region is oil. And these oil reserves were discovered fairly early in Syria, even in the early 1900s, which doesn't show up here, but it's 1908. In Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and Bahrain, it happened in the 1930s. In Qatar in the 1940s, and in some of the other regions some of the other countries of the region a little later, 1950s, 60s, and in Yemen as late as the 1980s. The richness of these oil reserves is huge for the region. In particular, Saudi Arabia has a deepness of this resource as much as Canada does, and some of the other regions as well, some of the other countries in the region. So there is a richness of this natural resource which makes it easy for the region not to make this fall into a curse, but turn it into a blessing. In terms of oil production, basically all countries of the region are oil producers, and most importantly, and I'm going to go back to this later, they all make part of OPEC, or the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, which has been very key, again, to turn this into a blessing as opposed to make it fall into a curse. So why is it that natural resources, and oil resources in particular, can turn into a curse? I mean, one would think, right, the more resources we have, the better. Well, there are kind of three stories here, and in fact, we've seen each of these stories happen around the globe. The earliest of these stories is called the Dutch disease, and it comes from the late 1800s when the Netherlands started to heavily export natural gas. And when the Netherlands started heavily exporting natural gas, it started getting a lot of inflows of foreign capital. And as they received a lot of inflows of foreign capital, there was a huge appreciation of the Dutch currency. And as this appreciation happened, it made it very difficult for the Netherlands to export other things to other countries. So basically, it makes you so dependent on that particular product that it makes it very difficult to diversify and to go to other products. And this has happened in other cases more recently, in Venezuela, more recently with oil as well. So one wonders why this hasn't happened in this region. And the reason why it may not have happened in this region is basically because what I mentioned before about this map, about the oil reserves being so deep in the region that you can continue to depend on this resource at least for a very long period of time. So even if you are heavily dependent on a single export, the issue is that this resource is not going to deplete, or you don't expect it to deplete in the near future. In terms of public spending, that's another way in which richness of natural resources, or oil, for example, can turn into a curse. This is the case of, for example, misspending resources. In the extreme case, having a lot of corruption because there are all these rents coming from this natural resource, and basically countries will misspend the money, or it will even get stolen from the pockets of the public budget. So basically what happens here is that usually there is misspending, there is spending that is not investment, and then it turns out that by the time you realize your natural resource is gone and you have not invested, you have just spent in nice things around, but then there is nothing to show for it. And in the case of the region, what you see is a lot of investment in infrastructure, investment in education. So while there has been certainly a lot of spending, most of this spending is in the form of investment. So you don't really see, again, in this case, kind of this natural resource curse that you may expect in some other countries. The third way in which a natural resource can turn into a curse is when these resources are used to finance or to fuel internal conflict. So you've all heard of the blood diamonds in Angola. This is a clear circumstance where there has been a natural resource curse, and where these monies that have come in this case from diamonds, have turned into a conflict and have fueled conflict and have stopped the possibility for growth. And obviously that's not something that has happened in this region. So for the most part, oil resources in the region really have been a blessing. They have not turned into this curse that they have turned into in some other countries that are very rich in natural resources, and in particular in oil. Now, what about institutions? Institutions presumably play a very important role as well. It's not all deterministic. It's not as if where you are geographically what resources you have and what nature gives you is going to determine your future as a country. So institutions are actually very much behind as well the economic fortunes of a country. In particular, legal origins have been shown to be very important in terms of affecting economic outcomes, in terms of affecting the procedural formalism in a country, the lack of judicial independence, property rights and protection of property rights, regulation of entry, bankruptcy law, labor law, all sorts of things depend on what your legal origins are. In terms of the region, you have that Saudi Arabia and Bahrain have common law systems. They're very much based on English law in the English legal system, while the rest of the countries are very much on a French legal system or a civil law system. And all of these obviously combine in many cases, and in all cases, in fact, with this dual legal system that combines also with Sharia law. The exception, and in this case it becomes even more complicated, is Kuwait, where you have a combination of common civil and Sharia legal systems all together. So this is kind of a map of the world and of the legal origins of different countries. And as I mentioned before, here you have Saudi Arabia and UAE having, and Bahrain as well, having these common law systems, and then all other countries basically having a civil law system. The problem is that usually the civil law system is associated with less growth, with more corruption, because it fosters excessive formalism in terms of legal procedures. It gives lack of judicial independence. It basically decreases protections of property rights because of this lack of independence of the judicial system. And because of that, it also increases corruption. Luckily, the region has avoided all of this. In fact, corruption is fairly low in the region as a whole. And if you look at this map, right, even though the region doesn't look necessarily like Europe or like North America in terms of this corruption index and showing very little corruption, it does show in light orange, basically, and it shows fairly little corruption in place. So how can you explain that? I think a very good explanation for this is that actually the civil service is very good in these countries. There is a very high pay in government jobs, and this reduces the possibility of corruption in many of these countries. So interestingly here, if you look again, this is this corruption index for 2010. If you look at this corruption index, so up here, you actually see Qatar. You also see the United Arab Emirates. Here you see Oman. And then in this category, in this light orange right here, are all the other countries of the Gulf. So for the most part, you really see fairly little corruption. And this has been very, very important because corruption is actually associated with less growth. So if you can avoid falling into these corruption traps, you can actually ensure that your country continues to grow. So this is all to say that in spite of legal origins, and again, this is kind of a historical axiom, right? Which legal system you end up with. In spite of that, you still see very little corruption, and as I'm going to show you a little bit later, you also see that many of the countries in the Gulf actually have they're very highly ranked in terms of the ease of doing business. So in spite of the legal origins, these countries have managed to do reforms and to undertake institutional change that moves the countries in the right direction towards encouraging growth and investment. So let me talk about some of these changes. I think where these geography and institutional factors come together is when you think about globalization and the ability to engage into the international markets. And there are really three dimensions in terms of engagement with the international markets. The first one, obviously, is opening markets for your goods and your services abroad, and that's increased trade. The second one is foreign direct investment, bringing capital into your own country. And the third one is migration, either sending labor abroad or sending human capital abroad and bringing human capital into your own countries to your own benefit. In all of these dimensions, the region has actually done outstanding. And we can talk about how the country has moved forward over the past 2 decades, basically very rapidly in each of these dimensions, and what the country has done, what this set of countries in the Gulf have done in terms of undertaking institutional change that actually helps for this globalization to be a benefit to the countries. So let me talk about trade, first of all. So again, here we have to be a little measured because actually natural resources and exports of natural resources are not always so good. In fact, in many cases, because natural resources tend to have very volatile prices, these can actually turn as well into a curse if you heavily depend on exports of a natural resource. And here's where the region really has gotten it right? The fact that most of the countries in the region belong to OPEC and have been able to protect this fluctuation in prices has really allowed the region to grow and to still depend on this natural resource as a key aspect of economic activity. So that has been very important. And at the same time, something else that the region has done, which is not true of many other countries that depend on natural resources, is to have diversification as far as destination of exports. And this is very important because think about the last recession, right? If the region had depended heavily on exports to the US or exports to Europe, you rise or you fall with that set of countries. If you have diversification as far as export destinations, you are much more likely to actually survive those ups and downs that happen in individual countries. So let me show you that in fact in all of these oil exporting regions and countries, you have actually had export surpluses, and that is to show you again that this Dutch disease type of problem hasn't occurred, right, where you end up actually with an export deficit. And at the same time, there has been a diversification as far as destinations. In particular, many of these oil exporting countries export to Asia as well and export to other regions, which would include Latin America as well and Africa, as opposed to just exporting to North America or just exporting to the EU. So this has allowed the region actually to isolate itself from all these potential problems of dependency on a few countries as export destinations. Why is this important? This is very important because, again, we have very good evidence out there, for example, by Romer and Rogoff, that's just one example, of how trade substantially increases GDP growth. So that's a case where you think, well, trade, again, is good at least for economic well-being, it's good for economic growth, and that's a case where you want to make this link about how the region has been so good as far as being able to take advantage of these natural resources, being able to export them, open export markets in a diversified way, protecting this volatility of prices, and being able to grow. Moreover, in the region, there have been some serious reforms in terms of tariff reductions in recent years. So most of the countries in the Gulf region tend to be on this side, which is where you have reductions in export tariffs or trade tariffs, and that is actually correlated positively with GDP per capita. So once again, it's not only what your legal origins are, but it's also how you undertake reforms in an active manner to encourage this globalization as an encouragement to the region. FDI is another area where the region has done extremely well. While FDI has increased tremendously, basically since the 1990s worldwide, in the region, this is really, really drastic. Basically, you see a 40-fold increase between 1995 and 2005, a 60-fold increase if you go all the way up to the 1910. So here's a graph. Here's where the region was in 1995 in terms of investment, foreign direct investment. here's where the region is in 2005, and here's where the Middle East was in terms of foreign direct investment by 1910. So the increases have been extremely huge in the region. And here, once again, one asks, well, what has driven this investment? And one thing that has been really key is investment climate. So investment climate, this measure that I showed you before, these low levels of corruption, right? The ease of doing business has been very key in the region. In fact, IFC just released its latest measures of the ease of doing business for 2012. And Saudi Arabia and UAE rank in the 20s. Qatar, Bahrain, and Oman rank in the top 50. So in spite of the civil law system, which imposes a lot of judicial formalism, lack of independence of the judicial system, the countries in the Gulf have actually been able to overcome that and create a good economic environment and a good investment climate for foreign investors in the region. Part of that actually is achieved by creating kind of a parallel system. So you have the free trade areas, free areas where foreign investors are able to come in and not be subject, in a sense, to some of the legal constraints that some of the domestic investors may be subject to. So that's part of the story. In addition, there have been many reforms, actually. So here's where we come to, institutions not being fixed. You may have a civil law system, but at the same time, you may undertake reforms in the right direction to ease the ability to do business in the region. So the last component to this globalization is certainly migration. And migration has been, again, incredibly drastic in the region. In the 1970s, in 1970, actually, there were 800,000 migrants in the region, or foreign workers in the region. By 1972, just in a couple of years, this increased to 3.5 million people in the region. By 2002, that became 12.5 million. And the latest figure tells us that there must be approximately about 22 million foreign workers in the region. So this has been a really huge change that has drastically changed the region. And of course, the numbers change country by country. So some countries, such as Qatar, such as Bahrain, seem to have low numbers. But in fact, as a percentage of the population and as a percentage of the labor force, they're as high as 70 or 80% of the entire labor force. So very high numbers of foreign workers in the region. This is important because this is basically a win-win. It's a win-win because the countries in the Gulf actually benefit from having enough laborers come and be able to exploit oil resources and other natural resources and provide services. It provides ability of this region to grow, while at the same time, we know that these 22 million workers actually send home about 80 billion in remittances, or 1/5 of the world's remittances to their own countries. And this is good because we actually know that these remittances encourage development as well. There is pretty good evidence that when remittances are sent back to these countries, in many cases these would be countries in Northern Africa, then these countries also benefit and also grow. And this also, given the way the system works, right, this assures that some of these workers are going to go back to their own countries to make their own investments there. So there is certainly something that is working as far as making it a win-win situation, both for the Gulf countries, but also for those people who are coming into the country. And at the same time, as far as the evidence that I've seen, although I know there's a lot of discussion about this in the recent past, is that what we can see is that just like in the US, there's a complementarity between the skills that the workers and migrant workers are bringing in and the skills that are here in the labor force in the region. So there doesn't seem to be any displacement of employment for local workers, but on the contrary, foreign workers are providing basically highly, highly skilled labor or low-skilled labor and complementing the skills of the local labor force. So having said all of this, it's very clear that the success of the region has to do in part with kind of some geographical endowments and overcoming some of these geographical endowments as well with the right institutional framework. It seems like access to waterways has enabled the region to access the global labor market, to bring in foreign capital, to bring in foreign laborers into the region. But at the same time, exploiting natural resources has allowed the region to export as well and to make the region grow without necessarily falling into one of these resource curses and to continue to change continuously. So this globalization process is to the benefit of the region as opposed to the detriment of the region. So this is pretty much it.